Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Customer Experience Considerations for Tech Leaders. I'm Elizabeth Heichler, Executive Editor at MIT Sloan Management Review, and I'll be your moderator today. Today's program is sponsored by Compunal and LifeRay. Our speakers today are Steve Andriole, the Thomas Labrecque Professor of Business in the Villanova School of Business at Villanova University, and Deborah O'Neill, who's UK Head of Digital and a partner at Oliver Wyman. Steve conducts applied research on technology management best practices, big data analytics, cloud computing, technology due diligence, digital transformation, technology governance, and emerging technology adoption. In addition to his scholarship, Steve brings extensive experience working in industry, as well as working with industry and government as a consultant. Deborah leads complex transformations at the world's largest companies. Key roles she has undertaken in her work in digital include interim CTO for a new digital bank build, delivery of an online real-time SME credit lending product, and the technology infrastructure build-out of a client's data and analytic platform. We're looking forward to hearing from both of you. Steve, over to you.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and welcome. I'm happy to talk about this really important, timely topic, especially given the perspective I'm going to take, which is all about technology and the role of the CIO. So that's really the takeaways. I'll give that to you up front. I want to talk about sort of the technologies that can enable, improve, some cases automate the customer experience. And I also want to talk about the role of the CIO, because that's getting more challenging, that's getting more complicated, to put it mildly, as if any CIOs and CTOs are on the call, you know exactly what I'm talking about. I've sat in your seat. I know the expectations are very, very high about what you're supposed to do, and given the shortage of resources. So what I'm going to try to do is go through some of the technologies and then describe a kind of agenda, kind of a very practical agenda for CIOs and CTOs. Let's start with the customer experience priority. Here's the agenda, of course. But the customer experience priority, it's always been there. I mean, it's interesting how we sort of, there's all these waves of attention that come and go, but this has always been there. The customer experience is something that everyone has focused on, not exactly the best way. If anyone's experienced a problem with a not so smart bot trying to do customer service, whatever context, it may be trying to return a product, it may be seeking information about a product, whatever it may be, you've experienced those kinds of frustrations. There are some technologies which we'll talk about in a moment that can help, but it's always been a priority. It's always been a priority. And we've always been looking at technologies to maybe improve the process, the entire life cycle, not just individual pieces, but the entire customer experience life cycle, which has been with us for many, many years. And you'll see in the last bullet there, I'm talking about the emphasis on the CIO to lead this transformation. And that's going to be adding another agenda item to the CIO's already long list, but we'll talk about that in a moment. I want to talk about the technologies, this and the roles of the CIOs. This is the meat of this discussion this morning, and I hope I can generate some good questions about this, because it's sort of a topic of endless discussion, and it's changing dramatically because of the technologies that are emerging so quickly, and the velocity of the technology change, all under this gigantic umbrella called digital transformation, of which this is a part. It's just challenging CIOs and CTOs, as well as all C-level executives, to think about the role of technology in all of these processes. So let's jump in here. All of us are well aware of the revolution, if you will, in AI and machine learning. And you can see some of the technologies there. There's many others, and I'm going to distinguish, which you'll see in a moment, between AI, machine learning, and natural language understanding and generation. I know that they're under the large umbrella, we're back to umbrellas, that artificial intelligence and machine learning. But I think there's an important distinction there. But anyway, to go back to AI and machine learning, it's to put it mildly, AI and machine learning have now come into their own. There was a time when it was referred to as the AI winter. Some of you may remember that, a long period of time. Things have changed dramatically because of the technologies, right? The ability, first of all, the availability of data, which we often need to train systems, but the technologies around image recognition, computer vision, machine learning, of course, all the algorithms, all those kinds of things, which enable us to be able to do some things we never thought we could do 10, 15 years ago, which have to do with personalization, self-service, and things of that nature. Facial recognition, of course, controversial, but that's another aspect of the customer experience that could sort of make it a lot easier for customers to buy, sell, all kinds of things. Natural language understanding, as I mentioned a moment ago, there's all kinds of things that are possible. I mean, ultimately, this is the perfect interface. Being able to talk to a chatbot, being able to talk to a CSR. I mean, all of these things make it so much easier and have the understanding and the generation. So chatbots, as I've already mentioned a couple of times, they're pretty awful today. They're getting better, but slowly. What we're looking for is prototypes in the NLU, NLG area to demonstrate the possibility here. If you read anything about customer experience technologies, and there's all kinds of things being written, augmented and virtual reality, they always appear, right? And I think as we have more of these toolkits that appear, then you're going to see a whole lot more of this, not to mention, of course, the AR and VR as a service, which all the cloud providers are providing now. So I think this is going to change. We need the business models around what makes the most sense. They shouldn't be intrusive. They shouldn't be dumb, frankly, but rather they should be very supportive and very helpful. But this is a very promising technology, again, because it's the technologies are now delivering it in a low-cost way. Not so many years ago, like 3 or 4 or 5, headsets were ridiculously expensive. Now the cost is coming down. Now, of course, we're using smartphones and other devices to affect AR and VR. That will change things as well. Offers a great opportunity, as does, of course, AI, machine learning, and LUG. Social media, of course, there's a whole lot of DM customer support there in social media. People should be able to use whatever channel they want to be able to communicate and to get responses that are coherent and often enabled by some of these emerging technologies. I think that's a very important aspect of this. People shouldn't have to switch from platform to platform to engage in a conversation or exploration or whatever it may be in the context of customer experience. That's another aspect of this. Video teleconferencing, of course, with real service representatives, although we're not that far, maybe 3 to 5 to 7 years from all kinds of virtual holographic CSRs, that's maybe pushing it a little bit, but you can see where this is going to go in the short term. Like right now, it'd be nice to have video teleconferencing as a ubiquitous channel. And I mentioned there holographic interaction. I just mentioned that briefly. Already there's lots of nice applications of this in countries outside the US. They're using this for virtual visits from physicians and things of that nature. So we'll see more of that going forward. Obviously, you can see what I'm talking about here is a way to identify and then integrate these technologies that can enhance or improve, modify, automate some of these experiences. So I think there's a tremendous amount of opportunity there going forward for us to be thinking about how can we leverage these technologies in ways we hadn't thought of before. And again, there's a whole life cycle, and we're talking about omni-channel integration. But my approach to this has always been sort of bottom up versus top down. I'll talk about that in a moment in the context of the CIOs. In other words, I don't think anyone should try to boil the ocean with this. I think it should be sort of the case-by-case basis, meaning that you look at an opportunity within the customer experience process, you select the technology with the most promise, and then you run a rather fast, cheap pilot demonstration to see if it makes sense going forward. So I think when you step back and look at this slide, and I could have added more technologies to this, of course, and I'll show you one in a moment from Gartner, where they've added many more of these technologies. You start thinking about, well, the possibility of truly enhancing the customer experience process is with us. It's within reach. Some of the technologies, of course, are more mature than others. Certain holographic interaction with obviously any kind of immersion is going to take some time. But nevertheless, you get the idea that we're talking about a whole series of technologies that, when taken together, can really, really change for the better the customer experience. So Gartner's always with us with these hype cycles. Many of you have already seen these. This is for customer service and support technologies 2020. And you can take a look at that. You'll see all kinds of things, right? So, I'm not going to read all of these, but very top left, IoT, Internet of Things for customer service. You can work your way down. These are the innovation triggers, even so far as to identify emotion AI, right? And of course, more standard things like blockchain and the like. So these are all kinds of technologies. And as you know, in the hype cycles, they identify the triggers, they identify the peak of what they refer to as inflated expectations, trough of disillusionment, slope of enlightenment. I guess what I'm talking about in the previous slide, we're more the slope of enlightenment. I really think there's potential on that list I just discussed. But everyone's got their view of the timing of this, of course. You can see where the disillusionment is around chatbots and things of that nature. Fair enough. But I think that the timeline, which again everyone sort of has their own timeline about when these things are going to mature. I think we're looking at 3 to 5 years of sort of massive change in customer experience as enabled by emerging technologies. I don't think it's 7 to 10 years, but I also don't think it's a year. I think we're 3 to 5 years, and I think the way you get there is through a bunch of controlled prototypes, and I'll talk about that right now. So the dual roles for the CIOs. So CIOs, I've been one, studied this, talked with many of them, written about this, conducted research about this, collected data, all kinds of stuff. They're under constant attack, right? The expectations about CIOs is sort of always too high. It's always maybe even different from some of the data we've collected from what CIOs believe their primary role is, which is, from their perspective, mostly to manage reliable technology infrastructures, right? To make sure that the trains run on time, to make sure there's reliability in their networks and connectivity, to make sure data is secure. We could go down the list, all of this, and identify the things that most CIOs perceive as their primary mission. And I'm not suggesting for a moment that that goes away. Unfortunately, we're going to add another layer of requirements to CIOs. They're going to have to do all of that always, but they're also going to have to prepare the companies for what comes next. So the innovation piece of this, which is always, in a sense, challenged CIOs because they've had lack of resources, they've been preoccupied with managing and maintaining reliable technology infrastructures, all fair. Innovation, I think, now is inescapable. And I think it's inescapable because we do have this overarching pressure around digital transformation, but I also think it's inescapable because of the emerging technologies that are accelerating at an extraordinary pace. It's not just emerging technologies to enable customer experience, it's emerging technologies to enable all kinds of processes. And increasingly, lines of business and lines of business executives are starting to look at the CIOs, whether they're centralized or decentralized, and say, how can you help us with this? So, second bullet, CIOs should own innovation around the customer experience. And again, I could add more things to that list. We're talking about customer experience today. And I think what's an interesting approach to this is I don't think CIOs should develop these elongated, expensive, complex business cases to, for example, omni-channel revolutionize the entire customer experience. I think CIOs should sort of pick and choose the areas that have the most impact. And I think the demonstration of that impact should be through these fast, cheap demonstration prototypes. I mean, we've all been around for a long time. I've seen people that try to boil the ocean, as I mentioned a moment ago. It never works. I've seen people try to adopt many enterprise-wide solutions, business technology solutions. They seldom work. So the idea would be to take something like, let's use the most advanced natural language processing technologies. Let's take our chatbots and let's go to work. And let's demonstrate the potential, first in a concept demo and then an actual demonstration. And if the demonstration doesn't go as well as you want, then you don't scale. You don't continue investments. Instead, you move on to another technology and another customer experience process. I think that's where we are at this point in time. Remember, all the while you have to maintain this wonderful infrastructure that's reliable and secure. Good luck with both of these missions. But I think the second mission is inescapable. So I think the technology demonstrations, they should be, based on rather short, not so ambitious business cases, bottom up, not top down, and I think you go from there. So, one way of doing this is to think in terms of investment strategies. And you can see there, that's one view of this. Many of you have done this, but it's a very simple one. You map the process and then you prioritize the opportunities. And again, not too ambitious here. And then you develop your radar. Of course, we all have that. You saw the Gartner chart, you saw my short list. And then you identify potentially the most impactful combinations, right? It's the match you're looking for. And I described one, natural language processing and better chatbots. And then you build these low-cost demonstration pilots, and you repeat, because they're not all going to work out. In fact, most of them will fail. So you need to prepare your audience for that as well. But if you haven't spent a ton of money, your audience is going to be more open to that going forward. If you spend a ton of money, you become the villain rather quickly. So let me go with the takeaways and I'll wrap up. Customer experience is different during the so-called fourth industrial revolution. Technologies can enable this transformation without question. The emerging technologies that I listed, Gartner listed, lots of others. And of course, CIOs are forever burdened with this dual role where they got to maintain the infrastructure and manage innovation. In this case, it's innovation with emerging technologies around the customer experience. And with that, I'll turn it over to Deborah.
Thanks, Stephen, for that. I thought it was really interesting, and hopefully where I'm going to go now is a little bit more holistic across how does the whole of an organization really think about that balance between that seamless customer experience and some of the sort of fraud, cybersecurity and vulnerability risks that we know that CIOs and CISOs are really being focused on. And so hopefully the sort of grounding that Stephen set in terms of the technologies and the options out there, this will sort of complement sort of around the edges. So as you all know, there's this balance between seamlessness and security, and there's often quite a tussle between them within an organization. We know that customers generally find more seamless journeys. So where we mean seamless, one click or very fast, not many interruptions, more enjoyable. But sometimes security forces extra checks and controls into the process, either redirections or extra hoops or authentication methods that actually can create a feeling of dissatisfaction, but actually can also go wrong. So you actually enhance the risk of that customer pleasing when you're actually trying to keep them safe. And that balance between getting that highly seamless proposition that's appropriately secure is one of the key commercial differentiators that I think we're all striving for in this new digital age. Just, I was thinking about this earlier and I was saying, well, if you take something that we all used to do all the time and sort of think about how that's changed, the one that came to me was when you had to go and buy a present for someone and you'd actually go to the shop, you would select the gift, you would take it home, you would dig the sellotape, scissors, wrapping paper out of the drawer, probably spend some time looking for them because you didn't know where they were. And then you would then wrap it up, you'd walk to your post office, you would weigh it, you'd sign some papers and you'd hand it over, and hopefully in a few days it would arrive at its destination. And today we just take it for granted that, we can go onto the internet, very quickly search online, and just within a few clicks, sometimes even with not even putting any details in because we've already got them all saved, we can have a gift delivered in a few hours potentially, all wrapped up and with a message included. And that's only been in a short period of time, and we all sort of take that experience for granted. But it does prove sort of challenging that balance for other organisations. So everybody's been on this rapid journey towards greater digitalisation. I think we can safely say, particularly given COVID, there's not much sign of that slowing down. So in retail, as we've said, click and pay is just a normal action. We pick up we expect to do that continuously. Of course, we now know we're also moving to a world where there's a potential for picking up the item, walking out the store, and the store just taking payment through some sort of facial recognition or biometric verification. And I don't think it's too hard a story to even dream. Would we one day have a fridge that just orders the milk for us and it arrives at home because they knew we were going to run out before we did? So that seamlessness is just pervading through our lives, and that's sort of hassle-free. But we know, and Stephen alluded to it, this doesn't all come without risk and doesn't also require new technologies. And I think for the CIO or the CISO or anyone who's had a remit for worrying about security, I think this has been very hard for them to sort of find their position in the organization, particularly if the people who are driving innovation don't have these risks front of mind. And I've been many clients recently where the situation has been that there's been a need to retrospectively apply controls and safeguards. And that does mean that people who have these jobs sometimes can feel like the bad cop or, the villain, as I think was described earlier. However, there is hope. I think if you can be at that front of the innovation cycle, can you be the CIO driving some of that innovation and be in the conversations, then a lot of the interventions to really balance this are quite small and can really be done as part of the designs of new customer journeys. And a lot of this is also around not just the technology and the things that you do for the process, but also that education that you take your customers on so they really know how to look after themselves as well. I always think for the audience, a question to really keep in mind when you're having these conversations is, where are you on this seamlessness versus security journey? And are you having those conversations frequently enough? We know there's a negative consequence of getting this wrong. And obviously when we had the very rapid increase in online behaviour, particularly around banking and other secure initiatives, we knew that there was an increase in fraud and data breaches. And not all of these were down to security issues within the organisation. Some of them were to do with, people making manual mistakes, or actually just customers not really understanding what they're doing and being taken advantage of. This has obviously led to some reputational damage for organisations. We've seen it across banking, airlines, travel companies, and some big fines that have gone alongside that. I think it's worth noting that the cost to global GDP at the moment of these sort of data breaches is in the magnitude of $1 trillion a year. And that's actually the equivalent of Argentina's economy being wiped out every single year. I mean, this is a big number. And, just to put this into visual for you, it's estimated that there's approximately 9 billion individual record breaches since 2007 that have been publicly declared. So that's, almost one for everybody on the planet. And, we can see that this will potentially be only the tip of the iceberg because this is the piece we know about. So this shift on online behaviours has resulted in that potential disconnect between how things are shared and secured, and has the security profile really kept up with the amount of online behaviour we're now all going through. So there's a number of questions that you should really be thinking about when trying to balance these two components. So what do we need to understand to determine the balance of seamlessness versus security? How do we communicate our approach to key stakeholders, both internally and externally, including regulators? And can we do it in a language that everybody understands? So we've got 3 steps to help shape thinking in this space. Firstly, examining the trade-offs. So for everything that you're launching, any new proposition, how important is that seamlessness versus the security to your proposition? Can you develop a set of sound design principles that help shape your strategies and allow the organisation to make sensible decisions, such as when is the right time to just redo a customer flow completely to address the new operating regime and behaviour and take advantage of some of those technologies that Stephen laid out earlier, versus just patching in an additional step into an old and expensive to maintain process? And finally, you need to support that environment of continuous improvement. Given this is going to be a continually changing area, technologies are going to improve, the way that customers expect to do things is going to change, and you'll need to always be reviewing this and actually making sure that your processes and your technology estate are modular enough and nimble enough to be able to go on that journey. So to just dive a little bit deeper into these 3 components, So each industry and organisation is different, and the trade-offs will be very different against that context. So the first thing you really need to do is understand your own positioning in the market. One piece of research I recently supported was actually looking on some customer testing on a new onboarding process, which was fully digitalised and only took a couple of minutes to go through. We did this in a completely white labelled manner without much context on who the brand or organisation behind it was. And initially, the customers had a very, very negative reaction to it. They said it felt way too simple, too quick, and it felt like they were giving their details to a tech firm, as they described it, and they felt highly uncomfortable. Interestingly, when we revealed that the journey was actually for a new digital bank proposition of a very well-known high street organisation, and we added a few simple explanations of what that data was used for. And when we say simple, you need to be thinking reading age 11. That's the level that you need to be using language to explain things. The customers instantly relaxed, and they were totally fine with it. They said, we trust our bank, you know, they look after our money, we really hold them to that standard. And they suddenly said, we're very happy for them to do it this way. It seems simple, and we trust them to know what needs to be done to keep me safe. And trust plays a really important role in the degree that you can really manage customer expectations. The customer was willing to concede trust because they trusted the organisation, not the technology. Interestingly, older, more established organisations often have a higher trust watermark, even if they're not considered to provide the best customer experience. Unfortunately, this does mean there isn't a level playing field, and it means we all need to understand our own positions in our relative markets. The mantra I always think about is trust is hard to win, but very, very easy to lose. So in some ways, that higher trust level actually makes it more difficult for you to be very experimental. Financial services providers particularly have a very high degree of responsibility to their customers, given they're regulated and they handle people's money. They're also typically very established organisations that customers pin very high expectations to. And it does mean that when startups or challenges come along, they are given more leeway by customers because people treat them as a supplementary offering or as a bit of an experiment. And they actually put them through that trust building exercise live whilst getting that better experience. So when that trust is fully there, they will then move over. And that really comes to my observation for large organisations, is that one of the best options to take is to take small steps to add convenience to someone's experience or outcomes. How can you add a piece of technology that delivers well in a seamless manner and really changes that expectation of experience? And then that starts to build you the permission in a safe manner to really move that experience forwards and wouldn't have been traditionally associated with your brand. And you can gradually reset your positioning. But it also gives you time to make sure you don't make any mistakes that could ruin that trust forever, and allows your operations and platforms to evolve at the same time as your customer-facing propositions. So design principles can really provide guidance to those who are involved in designing these new solutions within the organisation in a safe manner, but also with that good user experience. They can act as a North Star and allow effective trade-off discussions to take place early in the development cycle and allow solutions to be agreed before it's too late down the line. Companies need to be having these discussions at the right levels in assessing what principles they want to apply to these three interlinked areas, and they need to have the right group of people around the table. So for the risk and the organisational comfort with that level of risk, you need your CRO. For platform capabilities, you need your CIO and CTO. And obviously for your customer understanding and expectations, that's your chief customer officer or your CEO ultimately. And increasingly, organizations are having a chief product officer who's really sat in the middle of this with the responsibility of ensuring all these trade-offs are appropriately made. The remit and owner for each of these areas is likely very different, and creating the right communication effect for each stakeholder is important to get this right. The question for you all to think about when you're creating new products or new offerings in the market is, how often are these conversations taking place before development has started, and hopefully not at the point where you're trying to go live and suddenly the chief risk officer and the CIO, CTO, or CISO are suddenly all being told that they're being spoil sports or are really preventing people going live. These people need to be involved up front so they don't feel like they're the bad news agents all the time. I've really seen that embedding risk professionals and members of operations and security teams into squads is very effective and can create a cultural shift to ensuring that cybersecurity and trust are part of everybody's everyday responsibilities, regardless of whether they hold a technical role or not. Finally, there are a long list of solutions that try to bridge the gap of providing benefit towards seamlessness and greater security to the customer journey. Splitting these broadly into customer-facing and internal activities, there's a constant need for innovation, and not all solutions are fully technical. This can be as simple as giving the customer choices and being transparent on what their choices will mean to their forthcoming experience, but you've given them the decisioning power rather than making those decisions for them. One thing that I saw in a UK bank that I thought was quite simple was actually for payments. Payments have become very one-click and sort of straight through processing, but they'd seen for a lot of their mainstream customers a high level of fraud, of people being taken advantage of. So they did add a little bit of friction into the process, but it was in the form of one question after you said you wanted to make a payment. They said, what is this payment for? Is it for goods or services? Is it to friends or family? Is it to buy tickets or whatever it is? And there was a series of about 5 or 6 options. And when you clicked one, the next screen said, do you believe these goods and services actually exist and are you going to receive them? And it was just that little moment of, yes, it slows you down for a fraction. And for some people that will be considered irritating, but for some people that might really save them a lot of pain in the long run. And as we get to more faster payments and, you know, every service being paid for on a mobile phone, we will need to think about how do we educate our customers. It's not just about the technology, it's also about that educational process. So we really need to embed this behaviour both into the way that we talk to our customers, but also into our development approach within the organisation. So it's never just coming at the end of the process as a bit of a tick box exercise, or where you have to retrofit in a lot of activity. It's really about how do you get everyone thinking about this all the time. So just reflect on some of the trade-off points again and just to challenge them. What degree do you need complete seamlessness in a particular proposition versus where is there some friction that's required to keep people safe? Do you really need to ask for all of your customers' data up front? And have you got an appropriate an expectation with the client to be asking for it, or at least explain what you're going to do with it? And are you a brand that's got a high trust customer expectation, and are you certain you're not putting that trust level at risk when you go live with something? So if you just take 3 things away from today, in summary, the pace of change in the growth of digital is startling. It's not stopping. We're seeing journeys get more and more simple, authentication getting more and more simple, and that's the drive that we're going on. But however far you go along the one-click process needs to be right for your organisation, and you need to continually assess it and adjust it accordingly. As I mentioned, trust takes years to build, seconds to break, and forever to repair. So make sure you understand the degree to which you value trust with your customers and how much tolerance they have for things going wrong. Risk appetite and platform capabilities are typically easier to connect and identify, but customer expectations are a third pillar, not often fully considered and incorporated into the strategies of the other 2. You don't want your customer experience to be eroded by poorly designed controls, but equally you don't want to put people at unreasonable risk. And finally, I think in summary, and people who've heard me speak before, it tends to always come back to this, is cultures and behaviour. One can argue that the solutions will be found in technology. I think we've seen how many possibilities there are, but you really need to focus strategies and drive change in organisations by having every single person, no matter what their job is, really embrace the thought of how do I really embed security, safety, and the right thing to do with my customers into everyday life, even as we're going at a fast rate of innovation and development. Thank you very much. I hope that was useful.
You know, Deborah, I just wanted to jump off of your presentation a moment ago. If you can also just make sure your volume is on while you're finding your webcam. How might competing interests within the organization make it more difficult for tech leaders to balance that sort of seamlessness with security? Have you encountered or heard stories of kind of difficulty where, a CISO, or, Chief Information Security Officer is having difficulty sort of negotiating with marketing over these kinds of things? What are some of the, is this generally a political issue you find, or are there occasionally, does it run pretty smoothly, I guess?
Elizabeth, I don't know if you can hear me. I'm having a few technical issues.
I can hear you, yes. We just can't see you yet.
Okay. Yeah, no, for some reason I've got the, the whirling timer of doom that I'm sure you're all used to on these items. But hopefully, if you can hear me, then I can answer. Yeah, I think there's a few areas where competing priorities become a challenge, and I maybe would say priorities and I guess points of view or responsibilities. And one of those is usually there's a big push for let's get the beta launch out, or let's get something into market very quickly. And I think that, CISOs or, people who have, or actually the chief risk officer, where you have some responsibility for risk appetite or cyber security, that can put you under a lot of pressure to be signing things off before you are necessarily fully comfortable. And from an organizational perspective, I've really seen that that's most effective where actually the sort of agile squads or the delivery teams are set up with people embedded in them who know these topics. So the use of secondments, or at least having those people spend some time with those teams up front, so you can map out those risk areas or those threat modules out in advance, so you can sort of be preempting it, so that when you do get to the point where you want to go live, everybody's already managed through that process to get comfortable with the amount of risk that they're putting everybody under.
Right. Okay. Thank you. And Steve, I just wanted to jump in on your presentation. You gave us quite a long list of emerging technologies. There are a lot of choices there for what people might decide that they want to invest in, especially, for this, in this arena. If you had to rank order those technologies, which would you put at the top of the list?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because I don't have the hype cycle kind of approach to this. Maybe I should. I think the one that would jump out at me, I would rank number one is anything having to do with language, conversational interfaces. So natural language understanding, natural language generation. I believe, and many of us would probably agree, that voice is the ultimate interface, that being able to discuss these things, whether it's directly, whether it's to a hologram in the future, whatever it may be, but being able to converse in real time to someone who understands exactly what you're saying, what your problem is, can infer the purpose, the intent of your questions, not just the immediate words. There's Deborah. I think that I would rank as number one. Number two, I'd probably move into the general field of machine learning, because I think an awful lot of things can be automated and made a whole lot smoother for customers, and all the supporting processes. So, most of that's going to be in supervised learning and machine learning, much less so in unsupervised. So, those are the two I would probably identify as the top two for sure. Beyond that, we could probably, it's anyone's guess. There's a whole bunch of lists that are out there, but I really would, if I were doing, as I described during the talk, if I were doing these controlled demonstration prototypes, it would be in those two areas.
Right. Okay. And I also wanted to ask you a version of the same question that I asked Deborah. It occurred to me as we were watching. The perennial questions about the role and influence of the technology leader or the CIO in the organization, as we're talking about all of the ways, and you laid out some very specific things that the technology chief should be leading. What's your sense of their degree of influence within this area of customer experience, which certainly belongs to certain marketing and others as well?
Well, to the extent that they own innovation in lots of areas, including customer experience, I think the influence and the expectations that I discussed will be high. But let me just say that in general, because there was a question related to, and Deborah talked about this, politics and culture and all that sort of thing. In my experience, all this is about political capital that you build inside an organization. So CIOs are not unlike any other executive. You must build this bank of capital that you can spend at some future date against a set of problems. In this case, we're talking about customer experience, and we're talking about spending that political capital in ways that'll be, and this will be surprise you probably, moderately impactful, not necessarily disruptively impactful. I think when we swing for the fences, we miss. And I think as someone I see Deborah's probably agreeing with this because you've seen this. So I think CIOs, CTOs, CISOs, across the board, what you want is a series of small wins that are measurably impactful. And that's the capital that you get to spend later on. And you've got to, whether it's customer experience or any other area, you've got to build this capital bank. And if you don't do that internally, politically, culturally, you're going to be fighting an uphill battle forever. So that's why I was suggesting very strongly that you go with these sort of smaller demonstration prototypes, the impact of which can be measured. Often they'll fail, which is fine. But if you pursue these enterprise-wide projects to revolutionize, to disrupt the entire customer experience with technologies, you'll fail. And in the process, your credibility will fall. And the last thing you need as a CIO or CTO with all these responsibilities is for your credibility bank to become depleted. So my advice to CIOs is to be really careful here, and to make sure that at least initially you're building up enough political capital that when you finally do want to take that leap to a more enterprise-wide, because you've got the evidence through all these prototypes, then you'll have some people behind you to do that, and you'll be able to get the funding to do that. Otherwise, you're just going to spin your wheels.
Yeah, Stephen, you make a really interesting point that just really resonates with me, is actually you have to be the person that's making things happen, not stop things happening. And I think that's a very delicate line. And I've seen the pressure people are under. We know that a lot of organizations are fighting with a large legacy estate of interconnected systems that are a constant battle to patch, and all of that pressure. But if you are the person that's holding people back, that's when people try to find ways to go around you. And that's where you can find out very late in the day that suddenly something's going live because, some innovation unit or some new products launching, and suddenly you're caught out. And then you become not only the person that was missed out of the cycle, but also the person that's then shouting and stamping your feet, which is, I think as Stephen says, that's why you need that political capital, but you've got to be on the positive side of all of this. And actually, it's a great opportunity to start simplifying your estate, right? If you can convince people to move on to cloud and some of these new technologies, in the long run, this should actually make your lives easier in terms of that estate that you've got to manage.
Right. Good, thank you. And Deborah, a few audience questions here for you. One person asked, should we sacrifice security for a great digital experience in certain cases? And if so, what would those cases be?
So I think absolutely there should be no time where you're just putting people's personal data out on the internet or anything like that. I think there's a floor on which security you need to be compliant with. But we see it in some of the not more freely or less regulated areas, right? Already, sometimes when you go and make online purchasing, or somebody makes an online purchase pretending to be you, and you make a complaint about it, they refund you the money instantly. And in fact, some of the organizations are very good at even saying, oh, that went wrong and I refund you before you even know it's happened. And so you do have more freedom depending on your industry sector to say, actually, we'll let transactions happen, or we'll let something happen, but we know how to rectify it. I think it also comes back to this point of what is your market position. If you are a well-established household brand, I hate to tell everybody, but you're held to a higher standard than if you're something funky and new, because people expect you to be more experimental. And that's why I think this balance of how much can you try all in one go, and making sure that everyone feels confident. I've seen a lot of cases where people create a new beta product and it hasn't been done within the confines of the right organization. It's built on a little piece of tech over here, and it looks shiny, but they have missed out important steps like the CIO or the CRO, or people who have to manage the downside risk of this. So I hate, I've become a bit of a broken record, but it is that communication and political internal that really helps you balance those things.
Right, thank you. Let's see, a question for Steve from the audience about chatbots, which have a bit of a bad rap. People can, our questioner says, they can sometimes put people off, actually, increasing dissatisfaction, and make it look like the organization is more interested in cutting costs than in delivering great service. Can we expect chatbots to improve dramatically, or would you expect that they may be supplanted by other kinds of other automation that might be more accepted by customers?
Well, I mentioned when you asked me about the rank ordering of the technologies, that natural language understanding and generation I put at the top of the list for that reason. I think there's a larger issue with chatbots, though. I think that it depends on the intent. The rules, we can write the rules about how they respond, but what are the rules? And to the extent that they bias in favor of the company, that maybe someone's complaining tremendously, someone wants to cancel their account, for example, and the rule sends them to 3 other people or some other functions in the chatbot that are basically intended to keep them from resigning, keep them from, right? So, I think those are the rules. True customer service, true customer experience is one that actually is customer friendly and is customer oriented. And so I've experienced, and we've done some research on this, looking at the rules behind the chatbots. The interface is one thing. That's the natural language part that I love. But then there's the rules behind them. So when you ask, let's assume it understands things really well. And again, that's why I referred earlier to purpose and intent. So being able to infer purpose of intent. You've got a customer who's very, very upset, right? Say it's a customer who's in pharmaceutical, complaining about the side effects of a medication. Right? So the rules can go a couple of different ways. So one way it can go is to tell us more about that. We'd like to deal with that. We'd like to help you through that. But the rules will also be written, and they often are, about, oh, this is an indication as a kind of back processing of sentiment that this person is going to stop taking that medication. So if that is inferred on the part of the chatbot, which is driven by these rules, then the customer is going to hear, in this case, the patient is going to hear all these things that are designed to deflect that, so they don't stop taking the medication and maybe go to a competitor. So customer service, customer experience is really at least 2 dimensions. One is the interface itself. NLP can help there. And then also the rules behind the experience. So I think that companies need to be thinking about that. We've all experienced interacting with chatbots. Again, it's inefficient, you're actually typing, all that sort of thing, and that can be improved with a natural language interface. But then it's like, you're not answering my question. You don't understand the purpose of my question. And I'm getting increasingly frustrated by this, because it's clear that not only do you not understand the intent of my question, you have your own agenda, which makes it even worse. So I think that we have to be thinking about this on several levels going forward. So the technology, and again, the technology can help there. And that's why I rank machine learning, right, number 2, because the machine learning, those algorithms can be trained to respond to intent and purpose, and in a way that is truly customer friendly, as opposed to, oh my God, let's make sure we don't lose this customer.
Right. Okay.
I think it also links to the need for organizations to be thinking about this front to back, right? There's no point tacking on an amazing front-end experience if you don't update your operations and how the way you run your organization in the background. I think, we've all come from worlds where people ran in very siloed, you want to talk about product A, well, that's that team, or you want to talk about product B, that's that team. But now people don't care. They don't care how you internally organize themselves. They want to just talk to the person who's going to solve their problem. And we are, you see the difference now with some of the organizations who have only established in the last, 5, maybe decade years, is that they are organized in a much more customer-centric manner, that they have smoothed the silos. So whoever you get to will know enough to solve 99% of your problems, versus that I'm now going to put you through to the team that deals with product A, or I'm going to put you through to the team that deals with product B, and actually I'm going to disconnect you halfway through the process, and then you're going to have to start again. So it really does pervade. Whatever you do to the customer experience, you've got to drive through the rest of the organization from front to back. Which is why these transformation programs that everybody undergoes become quite difficult, because it's usually someone driving from just one agenda, which is why all those three sort of areas have to work together quite tightly.
Right, got it. Another question for you, Deborah, that relating to again, a bit of the corporate culture piece of it that you touched on in your presentation. Can you dive a little bit more into? You did speak to the need to develop a culture of security mindedness that permeates the organization, whether or not it's their job. How have you seen this been done effectively?
So I think a really simple thing you can do is sort of, monthly or every couple of months, getting your teams together and doing kind of a threat modeling brainstorming session, right, where you say, okay, let's look at our process that we're running. Where are all the places that we could be vulnerable? Either vulnerable to a customer doing something wrong, not understanding what you're asking. Where is our vulnerability because we have a manual intervention where we don't have enough control around it? And you're constantly getting everybody to look at that from different angles, because you get very interesting perspectives. Somebody from marketing might say, actually, I've seen something out in the industry that now makes this look like we may get a reputational risk because actually people don't like this experience anymore. Or you'll get one of the engineers that says, actually, I've noticed that we haven't upgraded the API structure for a while and checked that, that the messaging system's secure between them. And you'll get maybe one of the analysts that says, actually, I've noticed that we've had to do a lot of manual interventions on this particular piece of documentation, and I feel like maybe we didn't have enough checks on it to make sure it's secure. So you just start that mentality of people really challenging their processes and thinking about it. And that's quite simple, because it gives everyone almost a sort of vested interest to get these concerns out on the table. Some of them will be minor risks that don't need any particular worry, but now and again, you'll just get that needle in the haystack where someone hits on something that's quite important.
Right. Okay. Thank you. And let's see. And Steve, we have one for you that's also kind of getting down to brass tacks. What are some of the biggest challenges or obstacles for prototyping and adopting some of these emerging technologies that you had talked about?
Well, as I mentioned, you try to boil the ocean, you'll fail. I think if you ask for way too much money, you'll fail. I think if you set expectations too high, you'll fail. So I think I've been talking a lot about and writing a lot about this bottom-up phenomenon, right? And I mentioned that in the context of political capital. I think a lot of it's messaging, a lot of it is communication, setting expectations, going for more incremental innovation than disruptive innovation. That may strike some of the listeners as maybe not a great message, but disruptive innovation is very challenging and very difficult. Deborah was talking about at the end, she said, hey, this won't work unless there's a cultural change. Culture is the hardest thing in the world to change. It can take years, and you may succeed and it may fail. And think about this, the management team under which you're operating that owns the culture may be gone. And then you have a new management team that comes in and tries to institute another culture, which may or may not work, right? So you've got, I really believe in this bottom up and just demonstrate something. So I think this whole idea of looking for that leverage between the customer experience process, that little point maybe, and then looking at the technology that exhibits the most promise, and then doing something in a very controlled way with managed expectations and being able to measure the impact, and then moving on to another prototype. I had in the slide repeat. So it's sort of like, incremental prototyping, another term, which is just simply going from one to the other to the other. Never talk about how we can scale this and change the world and change the culture. And our customers will all of a sudden love us to death because we're going to do this one prototype, which will be scaled and deployed globally. That's insane. And CIOs that try to do this, they will fail. So I think, again, you want to start small with prototyping, manage the expectations, measure the impact. It's got to be quantitative, empirical impact. It can't be anecdotal. You can't do that, because then people will be able to offer their own anecdotes that contradict your anecdote. So it's got to be quantitative, empirical. It's got to be a relatively small scale, and then you move from that. You move up with another prototype and another prototype. So I think it's cautious. I guess it's a conservative approach to leveraging technology against customer experience processes. But in my experience and the data we've collected, that's what works.
Okay, and you kind of queued up for me what we have time. We've just a few minutes left, so this will be sort of maybe a little bit kind of a lightning round question for both of you. You mentioned, quantitative measures of impact, and we had a good question about what are the KPIs? How do you measure success, both in customer experience broadly, but also, maybe Deborah in threading that needle between, security and experience. Deborah, what do you think are some of the key measures that people should be using to hold themselves accountable?
Yeah, I mean, the big one that I know the whole industry goes on and on about is, have you got things like your DevOps pipeline working well? Can you do that continuous deployment? So if you do put something out there and people like it, how can you develop it further? How can you add in new functionality if you need to? If they don't like it, how do you get it out again? So, I think there's something around that measure of how quickly you can deploy things, how frequently you can deploy things is a great one. I think, around operations and some of that customer interactions, obviously people go on about cost, as Stephen rightly says. We don't want people to feel on the other side that it's all about cost. But there is something around cost to serve, and also not just the cost to serve, but the cost to get to satisfaction, because there's the cost of servicing the call and people not being satisfied and losing that business. So how do you get that, cost to serve and cost to satisfaction at the right level? And then I think there is something around measuring, your attack plane. If you put something out there, how many attacks are you getting? Hopefully you're actually measuring them, because actually if you know they're coming, then you're doing something about them. The worst ones are the ones you didn't know and they get inside your perimeter. But being very aware of what's our attack profile, and where are those attacks coming from. So some of it's very standard sort of KPIs around that. Service management is a massive topic now. If you're working with a lot of third parties, what are your service management KPIs? Availability, responsiveness, latency, all of those good things would be my view.
Great, thank you. Steve, do you have 30, and can you share any 3 seconds?
Yeah, no, I'll say just in the context, keeping it small again, so chatbots, making some changes, making some fixes with NLP, natural language processing, broadly defined. You can certainly measure the effectiveness of that, right? The abandonment, how many people leave a call, how many repeated questions. These are all the quantitative, and then the outcomes. So I mentioned the example, for example, of pharmaceutical companies trying to prevent people from stopping to take medication. You can measure that as well. So there's a whole series of things that can be through sentiment analysis, but you can measure all sorts of things like that against a set of outcomes. I did it in 30 seconds.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, both of you. That concludes our program. And thank you both so much, Steve and Deborah. I wish we had more time. We had a lot of good questions. I felt like we were just getting started. Good discussion there. Thank you to everyone who attended today. And of course, thanks to our sponsors, Compunal and LifeRay. We hope you'll join us again soon.